Okay, well, this is the first. Welcome to a brief history of everything. I am your host, Chris Buchanan. I am a high school teacher and history, well, we use the word nerd. It's probably the best way to put it. The basic idea for this podcast is not to actually give you the brief history of everything to a high standard. As a high school teacher, I've got a lot of questions from a very good, gifted and talented Year 7 history class, and they're very high-end questions, and I decided the best way to deal with this was to take one question from the weekly. These are all written by the kids, and then just look to answer and expand on those over the course of a podcast and basically give them a freedom to whatever they want to talk about. So there will be a random series of historical topics that don't really have rhyme or reason except that a student in Year 7's asked. I'll be getting different people in every week to do the podcast with me to give their own view on things. Now, what I've decided to do today is I decided to pick somebody who, well, provides a good drop of red wine. That's a really handy start to the proceedings. My friend Thomas Ellie, who also is a fellow high school teacher. Thomas.
Hello.
Good to have you on the podcast in the first episode. Now, what we decided to do was tackle something nice and gentle and nice and simple and fun, I think is the key term that we're going to go with here is fun. And the fun topic we have today is from one of my students called Jack, who asked, what was the most successful assassination? As you can see, a topic full of mirth and merriment.
Oh, one of the more uplifting conversations I've had this week.
Very lighthearted, especially with the week's events taking place. So what we wanted to do with the topic is rather than just sit here and list off people who were killed and was it successful or not, because chances are, if it's on the list, they were killed. So that's an assassination and probably successful. What we actually wanted to do was come up with a couple of clarifications. Now, the first thing we wanted to go through is what is actually an assassination? So what do you count, Thomas, as an assassination?
I think, like all good students of history, my first port of call whenever I have any question is Wikipedia. And Wikipedia would tell us that an assassination, reading straight from the page, is the deliberate killing of a person, often, but not always, a political leader or ruler, usually for political reasons or payment. And I think in that definition, the political reasons are the thing, or the things that we will need to clarify, in that the political reasons are the aim that they are trying to achieve.
I think that's the key element here is to look at the idea of why someone was killed or assassinated. And again, if there is a difference between just murder and assassination, I say the word just murder like it's a simple and wonderful thing on its own, which of course it's not. But I think to look at the difference between a murder and an assassination, it can be hard for people to understand. Why is that person being killed a murder? But why is someone else an assassination? And I think that clarification is tricky. And I think even that definition from Wikipedia, which of course we all know is a wonderful source and a very highly prized resource, especially among teachers. Reference that for your assignments, kids. See how that goes. But I think that the big thing there is that the definition provided, the key part for me, and I agree with you, is the political reasons. You know, is there a political purpose behind why that person was killed? We've spoken before, for example, about John Lennon, the Beatles member, who was gunned down in New York City, and he was very much into a lot of the non-violent protest movements and was a very big social campaigner and activist. And it's often talked about the assassination of John Lennon and him being assassinated when he was shot. But for me, the man who killed him, Mark Chapman, wasn't killing him for a political purpose. He was killing him because he believed that John Lennon had been replaced by an alien, and Mark Chapman was, not surprisingly, criminally insane.
Because Holden Caulfield told him to?
No, not because Holden Caulfield told them to. Read The Catcher in the Rye, kids. It's a wonderful book. But that, I think, is the key for me. I don't consider that John Lennon was assassinated because he wasn't killed for political purpose. He was killed by a madman who thought he was an alien. So I think that's a really clear sort of distinction to make there. Have you got anything else on how you would Any that you see, for example, being not necessarily an assassination, or
I think just going back to one of the more theoretical points that you just raised was that murder and assassination are very closely linked, and I think if you tie in the notion of manslaughter and murder, you'll first get to a very clear understanding wherein manslaughter is almost like an accidental killing, whereas murder implies intent. If we take that murder implies intent and assassination is for political reasons, then an assassination is a murder which has political intent, as opposed to just a basic intent, which would be a wholesale murder. So once the political intent comes into it, we start moving into the realm of an assassination, as opposed to just a basic murder. And when you look at that John Lennon case, for example, there is no political intent, so you sort of by default have to say, well, it's a murder more than it is an assassination.
And the other thing is too, I think unintended political consequences, I think, make it a bit more of a grey area, but I don't believe you can necessarily just say it's an assassination if there are unintended political consequences.
Yeah, something that sort of happens by accident.
Yeah,
say, for example, gun reform. If that was a result from someone having access to weapons in a country where weapons were previously freely available, and then gun reform comes in, that is political change, but it doesn't necessarily directly relate back to the purpose of the killing, and consequently I think you do enter that grey area.
And the other thing I think we'll look at a little bit later as well is the idea of how far down the track do these consequences still count as being part of the motive or part of the reason why someone was killed.
Yeah, exploring those long-term and short-term notions of the effects of an assassination or the fulfillment of political aims. So there's going to be an even more greying of that grey area, so to speak.
You know, there's the one that, and I won't go into it because for a lot of you, or pretty much everybody, you'll have no idea who he was. But Alexander of Yugoslavia, which was a guy from World War II. No, he's the ruler of Yugoslavia. He's leaning towards the Germans. He's assassinated. That is true. He is a political assassination. There is no doubt about that. The consequences of that eventually, several years down the track, are that his assassination actually helps the Allies win World War II because of the reaction of Russia. Now, no one, when he was killed, intended that. So I don't think you can link those two events together and say, well, yes, a success because they won World War II. That wasn't the intent. And after a while, you have to stop linking the two together as a deliberate act and start looking at, well, that just happened to be a bit of luck that came out of it. So the second part of the question, before we start getting into some of these assassinations, is the question asked, what was the most successful assassination? How do you actually judge success? That's the other tricky bit. We said before, success can't necessarily just be the person died, because that's a murder. Success on an assassination is, did you achieve any of your aims when you set out to kill the person beyond just killing that person? And I think that's the next step. So again, success, how do you see it in terms of the question?
I think success is one of those sort of Hall of Fame history words. Success, significance, importance, impact, those sorts of words that you're asked to assess in a history question. Success is right up there with all of them.
It's up there with a to what extent.
Yeah, to what extent is this a successful X, Y, or Z? But obviously success comes back to the fulfillment or achievement of a particular aim or a particular purpose. And once we sort of establish that there is an aim or a goal, an end goal for this action, you would think naturally that a measurement of that would be somewhat easier. But once you get into the realm of politics, as we're seeing sort of today in our electioneering on TV, every 30 seconds, the measurement of political success is very difficult to measure on a sort of significant basis. Even our politicians today have to sell us on the idea that they have been successful in any shape or form. Malcolm Turnbull is trying to convince us that the Liberal Party's been successful. Bill Shorten's trying to convince us that the Labor Party can be successful. Whether they're doing a good job of that or not is going to be a personal opinion. But the fact that they have to sell us their success means that political success is very hard to see in a natural state.
And Donald Trump, of course, spends every 5 seconds selling us on the fact that he's been successful in, well, everything he's ever done.
Everything he's ever touched, yes. Including combing his hair.
Exactly, and what a lovely coif it is too. But for a little bit of that, just to go to the evaluation side of things on that success idea, what we thought we'd do to start us off is we'd actually raise probably 2 of the most famous assassinations ever to stress why I don't think they count as being successful. And I think this is the first thing that I really want to get into with this point, is that the 2 assassinations are the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and the assassination of John F. Kennedy. I personally don't think you can count either of these under the definition of successful assassinations. Now, were both men killed? Yes. Were they killed very publicly? Yes. But Lincoln, for example, by the time Lincoln is shot by John Wilkes Booth in Ford's Theatre, the Civil War is over. The cause of the South is really, it's done for by this point in time. Lincoln's shot after the Emancipation Proclamation. He's shot after the war is, it's in its dying days. They're getting ready for the surrender. They're organising the surrender. What it actually does, rather than dealing with Lincoln, who wanted to bring the country back together again and was looking in terms of, at this point in time, most historians will say that Lincoln was making plans for the way that the South was going to be brought back into America. What actually happens is you get a vice president who escaped assassination himself, in Andrew Johnson, who is far more likely to go and take out revenge, which is exactly what he does. And the Reconstruction period actually causes a lot of damage to the South. The cause of the South isn't helped by the assassination of Lincoln. If anything, it actually suffers a great deal.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that context brings to this situation, that Johnson was a vice president picked because he was a hard-headed Democrat who had stayed loyal to the Union. And now, for the people who aren't necessarily familiar with the politics of the Civil War, the Democrats at that time, which is currently the party of Obama, were the Southern were primarily Southern politicians who held true to slavery, and they had been part of the people who had seceded from the Union. Now, there were a number of Democrats who had been elected in northern states who were not supporters, or not in states that were supporters of slavery. They were against the war itself, but Johnson was a unique Democrat wherein he had pledged his loyalty, so to speak, to the Union itself, and that's what Lincoln had said he was fighting for more than the end of slavery, the preservation of the Union. And when Johnson sort of takes over from Lincoln, you have a Democrat who is very antagonistic to the South, more so because, you know, his boss, the president, had just been assassinated. Johnson himself had escaped the same assassination plot, and one way of venting his fury, so to speak, was to take it out on the South. And the Reconstruction period that follows, which is the reconstruction of the Union and bringing the South back into the fold but eliminating slavery, is very much tempered with this northern antagonism that Johnson seems to represent, as opposed to Lincoln, who would have been much more probably welcoming with more open arms, and remembering that Lincoln would have had a good another 2 or 3 years on his term, and had expressed sympathies to not slavery but the plights of the South.
Yeah, I think that is a very clear case of a situation where the person carrying out the assassination, in this case John Wilkes Booth, isn't thinking, we talk about thinking long term. Now, what you also have to take into account is the circumstance and the situation. And this is somebody who, you know, in all accounts that it is spoken of, is someone who has a deep passion for the South. He's not just a man from the South of the United States of America, but is a very passionate Southerner who believes strongly that his rights have been violated and that his livelihood and his right to live as a Southerner is being challenged by the North, and he's being told what to do by the North. And so in his mind, he was doing the right thing. And again, the way that he expresses this during the assassination plot itself, I think, speaks volumes to the way that he viewed Lincoln in particular.
Yeah, what's interesting though is that in America at this time, you've got I wouldn't necessarily say half the population, but certainly half the states are very antagonistic to Lincoln, and throughout his 1.5 terms, he actually only is tried to be. There's only 2 attempts on his life. One is unsuccessful in his first term, and then the second one is obviously successful. So there's something to be aware of, that it takes a very unique individual to muster up whatever it is. One might say courage, others might say insanity, to actually go through with an assassination. And it's just worth throwing out there that it's not a regular occurrence, it's an irregular occurrence, so to speak. And being irregular, we have one of those strange glitches in history wherein millions of people hate Lincoln but aren't prepared to take up arms against him. And here comes John Wilkes Booth, who is not just happy to, but willing to kill the president for ideas and beliefs that he holds true. And is driven with such a passion of the South, as you said, seeing himself more as a Southern American as opposed to an American, and has been now offended by the North's supposed incursion on the Southern states' rights.
I think the other thing to go along with your point that you mentioned before there about it's not a very common occurrence, and it really isn't a common occurrence. And the other thing you need to consider as to why it's not a common occurrence is the usual thing that befalls the person or the people who are carrying this plot out. They're either usually killed on the spot, or they're tried and convicted later on and sentenced to execution in most cases, not all.
Like treason.
Yeah, it's usually treason. Exactly. Now, I think that leads us quite nicely, though, into the other example, which is the Kennedy assassination, because here we are talking about people getting, punished for their crime and killed instantly, and we do have somebody, obviously, who is killed for the crime. But in the case of the Kennedy assassination, why I think you can't argue that it's a successful assassination is we don't actually know the purpose behind the assassination, because the full plot to assassinate Kennedy has still, to this day, never been uncovered. And that's not just somebody talking in terms of conspiracy and there's conspiracy theories out there. This has now been proven by the House Committee on Assassinations and 2 or 3 other following committees that have said that there was more than one shooter and that not everyone connected with this crime was caught. So I think the Kennedy one is a sort of a very interesting case because it's the most public. I mean, it's on film. We have the Zapruder footage, which is the film of Kennedy being assassinated. There's more than one set of films documenting this now. There's more than one person who was filming on that day, which we've now started to uncover more of those films. Still doesn't mean we've actually uncovered who did it or where the shots came from or how many of them were fired. There's still all this disputed evidence, and even with modern technology, there's still no real clear clarification in terms of what happened there. But what we do know about the Kennedy assassination is that apart from being very public, and when you say assassinations, people tend to go Kennedy. It's something that goes along with the name.
People in the West, yes.
Yeah, it's something that goes along with the name, definitely. His brother also assassinated several years after he was. But when you think in the West, assassinations, and you go Kennedy, that's an example where we still don't know what happened, and it's a very rare case indeed.
I think with Kennedy, the best way to approach his assassination is to first approach the history and form a narrative in your head as to why Oswald killed him, because we're never going to know why. So you have to come up with your own understanding once you study as much history as possible. When you look at the sources and you look at the evidence that's out there, what in your head makes the most sense. Now, once you do that, you come to what I say is a historical narrative, because it's not a historical truth or fact, because he's killed before he's ever able to tell us why he killed or if he killed. Kennedy.
And just quickly for those who aren't aware, Lee Harvey Oswald, who is the man who is accused of shooting Kennedy, is himself a couple of days later shot in the car park of the Dallas police station by a man called Jack Ruby, who, when he's asked why he did it, his reply is that he did it for Jackie Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's wife, so she didn't have to sit through the trial and didn't have to hear this man speak. So you were saying?
Yeah, so when I've looked at the history, and I'm sort of a bit fortunate that I have to revisit this history on a yearly basis, because one of our units in Year 10 history is JFK in elective history, and we just look at the assassination from start to finish. And it's always fascinating because when we get to the conspiracy theories, everyone assumes Illuminati confirmed and the New World Order is coming.
It's always Illuminati. It's always Illuminati confirmed.
Always Illuminati confirmed.
When in doubt, kids, Illuminati. Write it in your exam.
Now, if you had to go with something, with a narrative that wasn't based on Illuminati, you might go with the narrative that I've formed, which is that Oswald was clearly a deranged and confused individual when you look at his history. Just a brief history, he's obviously born in America, but at a period of time he defects to Russia, pledging his allegiance to communism, comes back to America, and then works to petition for America to be much more sympathetic to communist Cuba. And so in my mind, I see Kennedy as quite disturbed, not necessarily fully adjusted or aware of his social and political surroundings, but sympathetic to communism and was antagonistic to the administration in that they were taking a much more hardline approach to communism than he would like to see, and that's what drove him to assassinate Kennedy. So on that basis, when I go back to whether it was a successful assassination, I would say, well, did Oswald's actions lead to a softening of American foreign policy towards communism? No, it didn't, because Lyndon Baines Johnson, who is the vice president, who ascends to the presidency after this, is much more hardline on communism than Kennedy ever was. In fact, Kennedy was showing signs of softening towards the final days of his administration. And so consequently, we see a hardening towards communism, and thus I would say it was not a successful one. But that's only based on my interpretation of history and is only as valid as my explanation.
Exactly, and I think that's the other interesting part with Kennedy, is that because we have to create our own narrative from the way that we view the story, that in turn creates the motive. Now, you know, there were people, some of the motives that were put out there were, for example, it was Kennedy's stance on civil rights. Kennedy had pushed a lot for integration of schools. He'd pushed a lot for improvements of civil rights. They were heading towards a civil rights act in America to improve conditions in America for people of African American background. Now, rather than, if that was the narrative that people were looking for, rather than actually stopping that process dead in its tracks, rapidly accelerates it. And Lyndon Johnson actually is the one who signs the Civil Rights Bill. And that great leap forward takes place under Johnson, who is completing the work of Kennedy. In fact, if you look at the election that took place for Johnson when he goes up for election after the Kennedy assassination, all the billboards and the placards and the signs in the Democratic Convention are not Lyndon Johnson. It's John Kennedy. Yeah, and it's all about continuing the work of John F. Kennedy. So in many ways, the assassination actually makes Kennedy's legacy, or not in many ways, it definitely makes Kennedy's legacy stronger.
Yeah, especially when you look at modern scholars being asked to rank the presidencies in order from best to worst, and they go back from Obama all the way back to Washington. Kennedy is regularly a top 10 president, despite the fact he served one term. No, not
one
even
term.
One term.
Well, almost.
Yeah, he didn't finish his first term.
And by the way, the reason he was in Texas was because he was in danger of losing Texas, which at the time was Democratic. It was blue. It was his state. He was in big danger of losing that, which is the whole reason he went there.
Mm. And it was the whole reason LBJ was his vice president to begin with. Yep. Senator from Texas, and was supposed to bring in Texas, and did so under very questionable tactics, which is probably another broadcast or podcast for another time. The election of Kennedy and whether it was actually legitimate or not. But
some of the votes might have found their way into some rivers.
Yes, bags of votes. But to go back to the idea of his legacy, I think no matter what narrative you come up with, it's very hard to see a way in which this was a successful assassination unless you say it was a successful murder. Unless you say Oswald just wanted to kill Kennedy, full stop, and thus we take out the political motivation, it's a successful murder. But your narrative will eventually come back to there being a political purpose. But everyone seems to have failed because the legacy of Kennedy is evoked by LBJ to fix civil rights or to approach civil rights, to hardline communism or hardline foreign policy to attack communism. All of the domestic and foreign policy agenda seems to really sort of take on a new form of much more severity. And the one thing that Oswald fails to do completely is to avoid the turning of JFK into a martyr. He becomes this icon for not just Democrats, but for America, of the and it's sort of called the Camelot history, the shining light off the hill that was never quite reached, that unfulfilled potential that Kennedy brought to the office and was cut short. He becomes a tragic hero for America, and even today is evoked by generally the Democrats more so than the Republicans now, but any politician who's trying to evoke a sense of optimism in America now evokes Kennedy, and in doing so, they're sort of throwing it back in the face of Oswald, saying, you tried to destroy a president and his legacy, and he's now more powerful. It's, the Palpatine, strike me down, and Darth Vader, strike me down and I'll become more powerful than you possibly can imagine. Obi-Wan, sorry. I'm
really worried here because I would have assumed that Star Wars being one of your key areas, you would have got that right.
I'm all caught up on the new Star Wars now, so there's no more Obi-Wan. It's all Luke, and what's Luke been up to?
As long as you're not getting caught up on the Phantom Menace.
The what menace?
Exactly, it doesn't exist. Everybody, again, it really doesn't exist. Now looking at the idea of failure, we're talking about failure of aims and failure of goals, and the idea of it wasn't successful. This is where I get to throw in my favourite, my personal favourite on this list. And yes, it's assassination, so it sounds weird to have a favourite. My favourite didn't actually happen, but it remains my absolute favourite failed assassination attempt to this day. And it's because it involves Andrew Jackson. So Andrew Jackson, a very divisive president within America, a hugely divisive president within American history. This is a man who created the modern presidency as we know it, in terms of the president actually having a say, the main say in everything. Before that, it used to go, people would vote for their representatives and the representatives would have a say. And then the president was just there to sign everything. Well, Jackson's the man who goes, people voted for me as the president, I get to pick what we do. I get to pick the decisions that we make. And if I want to do something, we will do something because I want to do it. Jackson does that. And Jackson does a lot of good in terms of the role of the president and giving the president power. He is also responsible for the Trail of Tears, which is the forced removal of Indians from their Native Americans from their traditional lands, and is involved in a lot of murder and a lot of slaughter in terms of those policies. So Jackson's hugely divisive. But what I do love about Andrew Jackson, and the reason why this is one of my favourite stories to do with assassination, Andrew Jackson was a legitimate war hero. He is a legitimate hero. He has fought very bravely and led forces very bravely, Battle of New Orleans in particular. He made his name as a war hero. He was known as Action Jackson, realistically, and he was involved in duels. Think about Barack Obama today agreeing to go and take on, Donald Trump out in the middle of the street with pistols at dawn. I mean, you wouldn't see it, obviously. Jackson was that sort of figure. Jackson was walking down the stairs coming out of the Senate, and as he's coming down the stairs, the Capitol building, and as he's coming down the stairs of the Capitol building, a would-be assassin came out with two pistols. The pistols were the old style, so they had the gunpowder. You had to put the gunpowder in there, and you had the ball sort of inside it. And what would happen would be that you pull that, fires off the powder, shoots the ball, person drops down dead. One problem, he shoots the first one, it's a really cold day. The gunpowder doesn't ignite. That's okay, he has a backup pistol. He pulls the trigger on the second pistol. Nothing. Why is it my favourite story? Because Andrew Jackson then ran forward with his cane and beat his would-be assassin up. The security guards and the security detail that were there to protect Jackson had to jump on top of the would-be assassin to protect him from the president. In the end, Jackson had to be dragged away while he was trying to kill this man with his cane. Now, that, I think, is one of the ultimate assassination stories, because you almost end up with the assassin nearly being killed by the man he turned up to kill. I think that it says a lot about Jackson's character too, but it also, you wouldn't see that today. Nowadays, something would happen like that. The president would be rushed off into a car. He'd be taken down. He'd be locked in a very secure venue. You can't really see Barack Obama running out through a crowd and trying to punch a guy in the face for killing him, can you?
No, I can't see that for two reasons. One, it would be very hard to even get near enough to the president to do that these days. There seems to be so much more security. And the second one is that as I was sort of just prepping for this, I read for the first time ever that there'd been 4 or 5 attempted assassination plots foiled by the Secret Service, the FBI, on Obama in the past 6 or 7 years. And that was quite surprising because nothing was ever made out of them. Now I sort of understand why they wouldn't make that something you'd publicise, whatnot. But interestingly enough that they were there. And so I think one of the main reasons why you won't see an assassination anytime soon is primarily because the intelligence services are far more sophisticated than Andrew Jackson's cane, which is what it seems to have been in the 18 teens.
One of the things that I found I've seen a couple of different bits and pieces on presidential assassinations, and one of the things that one of the former heads of the Secret Service was saying with regards to why it is so much harder today is that everywhere the president goes, there are 4 different checkpoints of security. And it's no longer a case of you go into the venue and that's it. You have to get through an outside perimeter, then a second level, then a third level, then a fourth level, all of which have metal detectors. And all of the last 3 of which also have now, because of modern technology, they've got cameras scanning and looking for facial recognition. And everyone on these watch lists has facial recognition that pops up on the computer. And if they scan the crowd and they find one of these people, they can identify them in the crowd and get them out before they get anywhere near. So the level of security is so ridiculously tight now around the president that you wouldn't be able to just walk up randomly. But I mean, Andrew Jackson's White House, for example, just to give you an idea of Jackson and his availability to the people, you used to be able to go up and knock on the door of the White House and go in and speak to Jackson.
Big block of cheese day.
So, exactly. And he was well known for his parties. Jackson had many raucous parties. There were people passed out on the lawn of the White House at all hours at many times during Jackson's presidency. Again, you just think of Obama having people over and playing some basketball, really. That's more likely what would be happening there rather than a massive party and people passed out on the lawn.
I remember the ruckus. This is going to be very wonkish, which means very in-depth political discussion. But I remember when Obama had a rapper called Commons over to the White House, and Fox News, which is a very right-leaning media outlet, and Obama is a left-leaning politician, went crazy because Commons had created or had sung a rap song. Or do you sing rap songs? Do you speak rap songs? I don't.
Let's just go.
I'm not hip with the hop.
You may sing a rap song. I mean, the young people will never know your flow. Please continue.
But Commons had sung a rap song about a dissident who had killed police and had been celebrated for it, and Commons had written a song about this, and the right-wing media, Fox News, had gone wild about it and really criticised Obama. Now, that was just having a celebrated and noted singer over who had a controversial record. Imagine Obama having the Obama family over and cousin Obama is passed out on the front lawn or half submerged in the fountain.
Underpants on head.
Underpants on head. He's got a New Year's 2014 hat that he's busted out. Lampshade on head. It's happening.
Oh,
beer pong going on.
You can only imagine the Trump party.
Well, first of all, it's going to be a Trump White House and casino. There's the first change.
Far more orange.
And you can wear a bathrobe in the Oval Office under Trump. Do it. There's no dress code.
By the way, your job next time you're on the podcast is you have to come on and sing or rap the Common song.
Challenge accepted.
So, and he will do that, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls of all ages.
We have stopped talking about assassinations.
I think we need to get back into assassinations
Yes.
eventually at some point. And I think what we'll do to do that is we'll get to one that, especially if you go on to year 12 here in Australia. Oh, sorry, we should pretend that we're sort of anywhere in the world, shouldn't we?
Yes. If you were to be any serious student of modern history, you would study this assassination.
Okay, we'll go with that. We won't let everyone know that we're in Sydney, Australia, and we won't do that. But because that would be bad.
That would be horrible.
That'd be very bad. We'd be narrowing our focus. Franz Ferdinand, not the band.
They're still alive.
Not the band. They're still alive and kicking and touring, I believe. Although you wouldn't really know it because they're not that popular. Again, I'm hip with the kids, yo. Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke, who was the heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian throne. His assassination is the spark that sets off the powder keg that is World War One. And I had some people in class ask me about World War One. And I had someone say to me, "Sir, what is the cause of World War One?" At which point I rolled my eyes and said, "I don't quite have that long to talk to you. This is just a 50-minute period."
The causes of World War One are a 10-week unit of study in Year 11 modern history, and you still don't even cover them adequately.
Or a 6-week YouTube course. Ask us how, kids. But what I'll do is I shall defer. I mean, I am an ancient and modern historian, however, I tend to lean.
Ancient.
I am indeed, and I tend to lean more that way, so I will defer to my modern colleague to have a bit more of a discussion about the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and we're not counting this one as a success. I think I classified it as fluke.
I don't know where I stand with it, and I'll explain after I get through the history, and then I go into my interpretation of the history. So the history really comes from a century or more of tension brewing, and without getting into the details, by the time 1914 rolls around, Europe is on the edge of war. They've approached the edge a number of times by 1900 and avoided it each time. And the general attitude is that they'll avoid it again, but obviously that all fails miserably. The important principle to understand with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand is nationalism, and that's a concept you'll encounter, ideally speaking, in years 9 and 10, which is an extreme form of patriotism, so to speak. It's belief in your country and your group of people as being superior to all others, and that is a wave that is sweeping Europe at this time. Now, Serbia also has a sense of transnationalism, which means nationalism that extends beyond just a country, and it is a sense of pan-Slavism, which means all the Slavic people, which includes people like Russia, Serbia, Bulgaria, the areas that become Yugoslavia, all those countries sort of north of Greece and a little bit south of Poland and wedged between Italy and Russia. They all believe in this idea that all the Slavs, all the Slavic people should work together and as one big nation.
Slavic nation represent yo. Basically, that's what they're saying.
Now, one of the, what you could safely call today a terrorist organisation, but in those days it would probably be fairer to call them a nationalist movement, was the Black Hand. And they're a group of people who live in Serbia and believe that the Slavic people should be independent. Who should they be independent for? They are all part currently of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, one of the big empires or the big powers of Europe. Their Austro-Hungarian thrones are being combined to be one giant empire, and under that throne they had controlled the Slavic people that I just described. Now, the Black Hand felt that they should be free and independent, and consequently, as a form of protest, a Serb might say, or as an act of terrorism, others might describe, especially in Austro-Hungarian at the time, they assassinated the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, who is Archduke Franz Ferdinand. They killed him and his wife.
And his really cool looking hat.
And his very good looking hat.
I'll actually put a photo up of the very cool looking hat. That might even be the picture for the podcast. Is the very cool hat of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who I think that's the big shame. How many roosters died?
How many roosters died so that we could get the that hat?
Amazing hat.
And yes, so what we find is the Black Hand acts in a way to get Serbian and Slavic independence from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now that's the history, and here's why I have a real difficulty saying whether this is a success or not. It comes down to short-term and long-term. Again, Hall of Fame history words there. Is this an unsuccessful assassination because the day after the assassination they didn't have independence? Or is it a successful one because 4 years after, or say a bit more, 6 years after the assassination, Serbia is gifted independence from the destroyed and defeated Austro-Hungarian Empire? At the end of World War One, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is on the losing side. They are broken up. There is no more Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Serbia is granted independence in Europe. So too are the other Slavic countries. Now, the Black Hands' aim, their political aim was independence. Does the assassination, which causes World War One, which causes the independence, does that mean it was a successful assassination? Or, because it didn't directly contribute to the independence, does that mean it's an unsuccessful one? Short-term, long-term.
I mean, short-term, it leads to them being, invaded and triggers the war. And I mean, the other thing too to think about as well, and this goes back to why I refer to it more as a fluke, just to bring it back to my point of a fluke, is that the man who pulls the trigger, Gavrilo Princip, he's there to kill. That's what he's there to do. He's there to assassinate Franz Ferdinand. Now, earlier in the day, he has a chance, and he doesn't do it. The car is attacked. When they get to the reception that they're going to, they come out to greet Franz Ferdinand, who instead of coming in very gracefully and wonderfully and walking in going, good to see you all, rants and raves about the fact that someone tried to kill him on the way. As you would, to be fair to Franz Ferdinand there, I don't think he's out of line to complain about the fact that someone tried to blow him up on the way to the venue.
Yeah, a grenade was thrown under his car, but his car was travelling so fast, or it was thrown under the wrong car.
It was under his car, it bounced off.
Went to the car behind him, which had all his guards and what have you, blew up that car. Franz Ferdinand drives off in a hurry. Well, the driver drives off in a hurry. That second car all the victims get taken to the hospital, and Franz Ferdinand, in a moment of astounding arrogance or stupidity, says, I want to go and visit my guards and the people, my assistants who were blown up. I want to go to the hospital. The driver has no idea where the hospital is, gets lost, and then the following happens.
So, Princip's standing on the street corner, despondent about the fact that he's failed at his goal, and clearly the Archduke has escaped. So he's wandering sort of around. Your favourite part of the story comes back down to the ham sandwich.
Yep.
Eating a ham sandwich.
He's hungry. Assassinating someone is hungry work.
And there were no Snickers bars back in those days.
No.
By the way, we're not sponsored, but Snickers, if you would like to, feel free.
If we're going to take sponsors, I think Aldi is a marvellous brand. Marvellous brand.
Aldi and Snickers. We're going for a very diverse range of sponsors here while we're at it. But he's eating a ham sandwich. The ham is probably sourced from Aldi, fine goods. And in the meantime of while he's doing this, he's despondent. Franz Ferdinand is on his way to the hospital. The driver, well, he's really there to take him to and from the reception. Doesn't know where the hospital is. He hasn't rehearsed this route. And normally, if you're driving a leader, you've practiced the route you're taking. He gets to the main bridge out of town in Sarajevo. Gets to the main bridge. And rather than turning onto the bridge, he gets lost and turns the wrong way. Down a one-way street, which at the end of this street stands a rather despondent Princip, who looks up from his sandwich and spots the car now sitting sideways because the driver has to do a turn to get out of the street. So he backs the car up and is now square on with Princip, who has a clear shot at both the Archduke and his wife. Princip doesn't miss. He hits both of them, they both die. Princip then attempts what must go down in history as one of the worst escape attempts ever. Much like you'd see in a cartoon, I'm going to jump in the river. So he runs to the bridge. They're all chasing him. He jumps off the bridge. One problem, the river was rather shallow. It was low tide. He crashes into the water and breaks both of his legs. Now, your favourite part of this story comes in here after he breaks his legs.
Well, the police, who are obviously looking to find the perpetrator of this, because government officials and the police obviously see the bigger picture here, that killing the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne is probably going to have not the best consequences for your country, which is already being largely oppressed. So they go and arrest him. Now, this is a man with 2 broken legs. They make him walk to the police station. Now, any sort of torture or punishment that they can muster would be nothing compared to that agonising walk that he just had to go through from the river, or maybe we could call it a puddle.
The riverbank.
From the riverbank. And they frog march him, which if you don't know what frog marching is, they twist his arms behind his back, double him over, and then walk him down the main street of Sarajevo to the police station. And there's a wonderful picture, which, if this was more than audio, you would be able to see. And look it up. Gavrilo Princip arrested. It'll be the first Google image search. He's in the street and he looks like he's being beaten up. No, he's struggling to walk because he's broken both his legs.
So, I mean, that for me is where the fluke part of it comes in. He did go there to commit murder. He did go there to assassinate Archduke Franz Ferdinand and, well, to a lesser extent, his wife, primarily Franz Ferdinand. And that's not in dispute, that's what he went there to do. But having failed once, it's very rare that the target comes back a second time. It's nobody in their right mind. Think about it. If someone was shooting a gun at you and they miss you, you don't walk back around the corner and look at them and go, "Ha, you missed," because they're probably going to hit you the second time because they're going to learn their lesson. Same with this. For Princip, he's there going, "This is God. They're not going to come past me again. They're going to go a different way." No, they drove straight back down the same way they came the first time when they were almost killed. Now, again, anyone would think that if someone nearly killed you driving down a street, you're not going the same way again. So that really comes down to, we've got a couple of categories there. We've got very public assassinations, but ultimately they don't meet their aims. We've got complete failure in the attempted assassination of Jackson. And we've got what I consider a fluke in the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Now we're going to start heading into, well, what is a successful assassination? Now, in doing extra reading for this, I found this much harder than I thought. I was fairly certain that I could get to a actual assassination that I looked at and went, you know what, that's a success. I thought that would be really simple.
I agree. I thought surely in the long history of man and womankind, we would surely be able to come across 5, 10 assassinations that you could say definitely successful. Like definitely the political aims that underpinned these actions were achieved. And the further I got into it, like yourself, the further things got complicated. Measuring political success itself was complicated. But the short and long term was something I kept coming back to. As we said with Gavrilo Princip and Archduke Franz Ferdinand, how long can we sort of say? I mean, if we look at an assassination which occurs to change something and the change occurs 10 years later, how far can we look at the chain of events and trace back? That is, as historians, how much can we infer and fill in the gaps? How much responsibility is there on us to create a narrative that may not be there, or to exclude events to sort of fit our explanation? It became compounded problems.
Yeah, I mean, I found... I mean, we'll go into the ones that we've sort of picked, but for me, I managed to find what I consider to be 2. That's all I can find. And there's another one that we've looked at that we sort of consider sort of a 50-50 shot, if you could argue success or failure, which we'll get to in a minute. I mean, did you find any more than maybe the sort of 2.5 we'll go with?
I think when we talk about, and I can't say I'm necessarily fluent in Vietnamese, but No Dinh Diem in Vietnam, his assassination, he is the Prime Minister of supposedly democratic and supposedly secular South Vietnam. He is himself a Catholic and persecutes the Buddhists in Vietnam. Now, anyone who is familiar with the ethno-religious background of Vietnam would surely realise that there are quite a number of Buddhists there. So really what he's doing is antagonising the large majority of the population. Anyway, that's getting into history. To get to the assassination, America largely allows Diem to get assassinated. They almost encourage and are 3 steps away from participating in his assassination.
I think you're being very generous by saying 3 steps away from.
I'm just worried about the lawyers of America coming after me,
because they are still suing a lot of people for the assassination of Diem.
Well, just with Donald Trump coming into the White House soon, I mean, it is an inevitable thing that it will be President Trump, surely.
Oh, clearly. I mean, he has to. He has to be able to go around and save money on the budget, for example, by walking around to departments and going, "You're fired. You're fired."
Well, one way he can fix the American deficit is just to sue anyone who says bad stuff about America.
And that includes suggesting that America has participated in assassinations of foreign leaders.
That's right. So I'm not saying America participated, but if this was a video podcast, you would see me winking furiously about the fact that I may in fact believe that America participated in the assassination.
And look, that
leader.
wink may be a wink. It may be a nervous tick.
Maybe a nervous tick. It's
you've had
exam period.
You've had a long day at work lots of stress, and that eye just twitches.
It just twitches. It's just I can't control it.
So
the same way America doesn't seem to be able to control overthrowing foreign powers.
One of the things that we are aiming for here is, and there's lots of podcasts that can make this claim, but the one thing I think we will be aiming for over the coming weeks and months, hopefully, is we want to be the most visual podcast in existence. I think without actually having visuals. We would love to be a show where we just go, "Oh, look at this," and you can't see it, of course, but we can, and that's the important thing. It's up to me in particular to convey this to you through the medium of my voice, which is bad news for most of you having to listen to me. To give you an idea of assassinations that I consider successful, I had to go back to 1801. Now, I know for me, as a somewhat ancient historian, that's modern. It's really modern. It's really recent times. In fact, it's too recent for me normally. But I'm going to wade into the murky depths that are modern history. And we'll see how I come out of this. No.
Get your filthy hands off my modern history.
No.
You can have your artifacts and your sand and your dust.
And my Ramesses the Great. We'll get to that later,
Not
kids.
Not so great.
That's a later podcast. Was Ramesses the Great actually great? We're getting to that later. But... And anyone obviously listening to this from my Year 7 class has already heard this and has already been swayed by my propaganda against Ramesses.
You've never come up against my propaganda.
Very pro Ramesses?
No.
Our propaganda matches. It was beautiful. Anyway, so what I found was I had to go back to Paul of Russia in 1801. So I know that everybody, for example, in my Year 7 class who's listening to this right now is thinking 2 things. One, what's that splashing sound? That's my colleague filling up his glass. Secondly, and far more importantly, who the hell is Paul of Russia? Right, now Paul of Russia is the son of Catherine the Great and Peter the Great. No, their last name wasn't the Great.
It was of Russia, right?
Yeah, it was of Russia. Exactly. They were far more well known as the of Russias, Peter. And they changed it obviously to claim social welfare. But
a social welfare system in Russia? Are you kidding?
I know, of all the countries to pick a social welfare system in, I picked Russia. Especially Russia in the 1800s. For those who obviously don't know, which I'm going to. Okay, for those of you who are in Year 7 and understood none of what we just said,
Do modern history in years 11 and 12.
That too, but serfdom is slavery. So it's a form of slavery. I'm not going into the minor details of exactly what serfdom is, but it's basically slavery. Easy way to put it. So the idea of them having a welfare system where everyone gets rewarded is laughable. I mean, you'd need a revolution for that to take place, and that's not going to happen for another 117 years. So
Lenin.
So basically, Paul of Russia, to give you an idea of the sort of happy-go-lucky guy he was, he's described by most historians as a schizophrenic with obsessive-compulsive disorder.
One of the better descriptions.
So it's a good start, right? He's schizophrenic. Now, obviously, that means highly paranoid of everyone around him, highly
Not that
suspicious.
any of this is a bad thing. You could be a very successful person with schizophrenia and OCD.
In fact, a lot of people would argue that to be a world leader, you probably need to be a little bit schizophrenic. And you probably need to have that level of paranoia about you where you're worried about everyone because it helps you stay in power, especially in an era where people were getting killed. So he's a schizophrenic with obsessive-compulsive. I'd actually like to think that his schizophrenia meant that he had multiple personalities. I'd like to think it was that because I like the idea that each personality cleaned a different part of his house for the OCD. I would personally think that would be a great mix. But anyway, he actually sought... Now, this is the sort of son he was. He hated his mother with a fiery passion, and I mean a fiery passion. So much so that when he became the Tsar, which is the king, the ruler of Russia, he didn't talk about his mother and instead talked about being descended only from his father. Now, beyond being biologically impossible...
Hold on, Jesus managed it.
Let's not go into that. So, but a lot, except for being biologically impossible for him to just have been the product of his father and his mother having nothing to do with it, it's a really interesting concept of, I hate you so much, Mum, I'm not even going to mention the fact that you were the last ruler of Russia and you're referred to as the Great. I'm going to ignore you. And in fact, he dug his father up and reburied him. With more of a ceremony than he had been buried with the first time, to make it quite plain. His father was wonderful. Mum, not so much. Now, a couple of things that he did that were a bit... Well, the main one that he did, which sort of led to his downfall, was the Russians had been fighting along with his Grand Alliance that was fighting Napoleon Bonaparte, the French leader who had conquered large chunks of Europe, large swathes of Europe, and then had sort of gone into exile, been thrown out, came back a second time and was looking to dominate Europe again at a later stage. But at the point of 1801, which is when he's killed, it's a period of peace, relatively, with regards to this. Russia's out of it. There's nothing going on at the moment. We haven't had the big, the grand returns yet. He actually seeks an individual peace with Napoleon. And he wants to form an alliance with the French and Napoleon, which would be okay if he didn't already have an alliance with Britain, who was Napoleon's. Britain was the France's sworn enemy, and Napoleon was engaged in this conflict primarily with Britain as the other side. And
I think for me, the best way to understand this would be to watch the episode of The Office,
yes,
where Jim forms an alliance with Dwight and secretly forms an alliance with Pam at the same time. It is so complicated and convoluted, and Dwight ends up being Paul.
I think the best way to work out anything is to watch The Office, but that's neither here nor there. But he kind of tried to form this alliance, but one of the problems was he decided that part of his stamping his own authority on this regime would involve sacking, capable military officers and replacing them with guys who sucked up to him and told him he was wonderful.
Which would be replicated some 100 and something years with Stalin, who does the exact same thing.
Exactly, but the difference between what happened with Stalin and what happened with Paul was that Stalin's officers didn't go out, get drunk and decide to come back and kill him.
No, that's true. They would get drunk with Stalin, and Stalin would then order their execution.
Exactly. But what happens instead is that the soldiers all get drunk and they turn up to Paul and sort of force their way in, and they execute him. And not only do they execute him, but then they go off and get his son, Alexander I. Now, what are you expecting from the family line at the moment? Well, what we've seen is that the son of Catherine the Great ignores Catherine and wants nothing to do with her. Alexander I, you can say in this case, follows in his father's footsteps, because Alexander I wants nothing to do with his father. In fact, he basically goes out of his way to get rid of his father from history. It's almost like his father didn't exist. He wipes him from everything. He takes over and goes, well, let's think about banning torture. That's the first step. He then turns around and goes, well, Britain has a constitutional monarchy, which means you elect people, but you've also got a king. Why don't we do that here in Russia? Why don't we set up a parliament, and why don't we then also have me as your king? Because he's not going to say, why don't we set up a parliament and I lose all my power? That would be silly. But what he does is sort of come up with this big hybrid idea, and he goes out of his way to do everything that his father hated. The other thing that he does, we talked about consequences. What do you think he did to the people who killed his father? The answer is nothing. They're not charged. They're not even arrested. He lets them go free, and yeah, there's no consequence for them at all. Now, judging by success, first of all, they wanted to have Paul out of the way. Tick. Second of all, they didn't want to form an alliance with Napoleon. Tick. Third, they wanted to sort of bring back a lot of the stuff that Catherine the Great had put forward. Tick. I think that's a pretty successful assassination.
I'd say so. I mean, there's political aims that they're trying to achieve there, and the son enacts them.
And the other interesting part, I think, about the whole process with the assassination of Paul is that at the end of the day, you don't actually have anybody who seems unhappy with the assassination. Like, there's nobody in every other aspect, every other assassination, somebody sort of makes the, oh, man, come on, sort of noise at the very least. And in the Paul assassination, it doesn't even seem like anyone coughs. Everyone just sort of goes, oh, cool, and moves on to the next thing. So I think that probably, I think we can both agree, is a successful assassination. That's a very successful assassination.
Yeah, probably in the reflections that we've done for this, one of the few successful, and probably you may get so far as to say the most successful, because we haven't been able to find one that in the short and long term achieves what has been set out by the conspirators or the assassinators.
Yeah, I think that the assassinators is a lovely word too.
Just sort of coin that.
We're going with that.
Trademark
now.
brief history of time.
It's trademarked now, so we own it. We own it and all its subsidiary rights. But yeah, it's probably the only one we could find where everything's sort of it's wrapped up in a neat little bow, and no one's upset, no one's angry. The aims that they set out to achieve are all achieved. No one's killed apart from Paul, obviously, which is a bit of a bummer for Paul, but for everyone else seems to be perfect. So I think overall I think that's a really successful assassination. Now, in the research, the only other one that we sort of could come up with... Okay, you got another one?
There was one that just came to mind as you were speaking there, and for anyone who is au fait with modern history and the Nazi Party would know of the Night of Long Knives.
Yep.
I think on that night, the Nazi Party, under the directions of Hitler, assassinated a number of prominent Nazis, and if you want to learn their names, do modern history in years 11 and 12 and study the Germany National Study.
Ancient kids.
No, you don't have to sell your subject if it's a good subject. And then, on that night, under the directions of Adolf Hitler, anyone who is a potential opponent or threat to Hitler's position and power is eliminated. Those are the people on the other side of the political aisle, but also people within the Nazi Party themselves. Assassinated, removed, forcible suicide might be a generous way of describing some of these things. These are assassinations, and they remove any final threats to Hitler's power and position. And from this position in 1933-34, Hitler is able to rise to be not just the Führer of Germany, but to then go out to conquer continental Europe, threaten the sort of status of the world and is only turned back by American intervention and a poorly planned Japanese bombing of Hawaii. These would only have been possible, I think, from my perspective, without threats to Hitler's power. And the Night of Long Knives, which is the assassination of all these people, for me, would be a successful series of assassinations.
Yeah, I mean, and the one that does get most of the focus on that is Rom. Ernst Rom. And
he's probably the biggest threat.
Yeah, he is probably the biggest threat. He controls, at that time, what is Hitler's
private
army, which the interesting part about that is that he's basically executed by Hitler's new private army. How do you get rid of your old private army? You hire another one to come and kill the first one. Can get very complicated if you get up to like 9 or 10 private armies. You've got to keep track of which one's killing which.
I know. I get mixed up after my third private army.
Yeah, look, my 7th got lost, and I don't know where they are. So if someone knocks on your door and you're not sure who it is,
just send them my way.
Might be my other private army, and please send them home. I miss them very much. But yeah, look, the Night of the Long Knives achieved all of its political aims.
It was extremely politically motivated, as opposed to drunk people storming the palace, perhaps on a whim. Now, that's not to say they didn't have political motivations, but maybe there was a bit of Dutch courage going on there. This was a coordinated and planned series of assassinations, not just one. So many people were killed on that night that it triangulated everything the Nazis had and laid the foundation for largely most of their success. Yeah, it's probably... Yeah, I'd go along with the fact that the Night of Long Knives as an assassination is highly successful. I mean, I think that the scale of it sort of takes it out of the realm of what you would normally consider just an assassination. But I agree with you in the concept of that it is a series of assassinations. It obviously takes place on the same night, and the idea behind it is very politically motivated. So I agree with you on that sort of 100%. The other one we thought of was Leon Trotsky. Yes. Now, everyone's favourite Kentucky Fried Chicken. He looks a hell of a lot like Colonel Sanders, who is the face of, or the founder of Kentucky Fried Chicken, KFC, for those of you who don't understand what Kentucky Fried Chicken means. Yeah, we're getting lots of sponsorship plugs in because we've got absolutely no money from anybody. Oh, look, I'll take a Zinger burger at this stage. I'll even take that as a payment. Small potato and gravy will do me just fine. That Deb mashed potato is a wonder. Chicken salt. Isn't it wonderful? Anyway. Deb. From Deb mashed potato to mashed Trotsky brain. Oh. And see what I did there? What a segue. Seamless. It's like I'm a radio professional. Trotsky... The assassination of Trotsky. Trotsky is a communist who comes through the Communist Party along with Joseph Stalin. And when Lenin dies after the Russian Revolution, in the midst of the Russian Revolution, it's Stalin and Trotsky who are the two sort of leaders. Trotsky is the ideologue. What that means is Trotsky is really the one who is pursuing this idea of communism, this idea of everyone should be equal and permanent revolution. And that's the big difference between Stalin and Trotsky is permanent revolution. Trotsky believes that their job is to spread communism worldwide. It's the job of the Communist Party to continue this revolution and not just stop. Stalin, on the other hand, is perfectly happy with Russia and just Russia. Stalin gets control of the party, really. Part of the way he gets control of the party is to basically suggest to Trotsky, why don't you go work on the rest of the world? I'll focus on Russia. You go work on this permanent revolution idea of which you're so keen. You're like our roving ambassador. But of course, the main reason he sends Trotsky out of the country is because with no Trotsky in the country, Joseph Stalin's running it, which is exactly what happens. Now, do you think that when Trotsky leaves the country, now these two they've come up together, they're both leading the party, so obviously when Trotsky leaves, and I'll defer to my modern history friend here, when Trotsky leaves, it's harmony, and Stalin works with what his colleague wanted him to do, doesn't he? Oh, absolutely. I think the division between Trotsky and Stalin is the sort of foundation for this. Trotsky, for me, is the more pure communist. He's much more closer to Lenin in ideology. So the Marxism is the original.
Yep.
Sorry, to go back to the start. Karl Marx sort of pens communism through the Communist Manifesto. The ideas existed as disparate ideas. He joins them all together under this banner of communism, which is also referred to as Marxism. Now, Leninism is Lenin, who was the previous communist leader of Russia before Stalin.
Not to be confused with the aforementioned John Lennon of the Beatles. Let's not
this is Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin adapts Marxism or communism for the conditions in Russia. That is largely called Leninism. And then from Leninism comes the next stage of communism in Russia, which is called Stalinism, which is under the rule of Stalin. But it wasn't always supposed to be, nor was it always going to be, Stalin who takes over from Lenin. Lenin has a stroke and largely rules for a couple of years. What Stalin does is he's able to convince Trotsky to go and work on the permanent revolution, and he goes out to the rest of the world and the rest of Russia to work on the revolution, while Stalin is cultivating the friendship of Lenin, who has just had a stroke and he's largely immobilized, and he'll have another series of strokes and completely die. But in this time, while Trotsky is gone, in this time, Stalin is able to stack the Communist Party with people who are sympathetic to him and his ideas of communism. And eventually we get a version of communism called Stalinism, which is much less like communism, and it's more about a cult of Stalin, which becomes a cult of personality. It's built around Stalin, the centrality of Stalin, the leadership of Stalin, and how great Stalin is. And in that void that Trotsky leaves, Stalin fills it with Stalin supporters, so that when Trotsky comes back and thinks, okay, now the fight begins for the control of Russia, when Lenin dies, it turns out Stalin's been preparing for a number of years, and Stalin just walks into a position of power, and Trotsky has to leave Russia, largely in exile, to have any sort of hope of living, much less having any sort of influence.
Now, my joke before about the mash and the potato and gravy and the mash of Trotsky's brain comes down to the method of assassination, which is unusual. It's an unusual method of assassination in comparison to lots of people who were shot, lots of people who have been killed through being stabbed in terms of with traditional weapons. Trotsky, I mean, let's face it, he's stabbed in the head with an ice pick.
Yeah.
The ice pick used to break up ice in a champagne bucket. Basically, he's stabbed in the head with an ice pick. He's in exile at the time in Mexico. He's in Mexico. The guy gets into the compound, gets in there, stabs him in the head. The security guards all come in and go to shoot the guy who's stabbing Trotsky in the head, to which Trotsky stops them from shooting this guy.
Because he's not dead. He's not dead. With this ice pick in his head, he's still alive.
He's still going. That's the thing. He doesn't die instantly. He's awake. He's conscious. He's talking. And he actually turns around to the guards and yells at them, no, don't do this. This man has a story to tell. And then they grab him instead. Trotsky is taken to the hospital, and a few days later, he lingers. Was it a few days or more? It was like 2 weeks, actually.
Yeah, it's a long amount of time.
A long period of time.
Stabbed in the head.
A long period of time. By the way, at this point in time, Stalin is expressing shock. Oh no! How did this happen? My good friend is injured. The comrade, please pray for him. He'll be wonderful. He'll be safe. He'll be good. He dies. The man who committed the assassination is sentenced to 14 years. Which, let's face it, in Mexico is kind of amazing that he got 14 years. You would have expected him to sort of get freed with a burrito, but no, he was 14 years. And to give you an idea of how upset the Russian people were, and the Russian in particular, the ruling Communist Party in Russia were about this assassination, when the assassin is freed after 14 years in prison, he's awarded a medal for being the hero of the Soviet Union. So as you can see, they really
tried to cover that up. Didn't
they? They mourn deeply the fact that poor Trotsky copped it in the head. They felt really bad. They felt horrible for it. Those of you who were in my Year 7 class understand the level of sarcasm in my voice and understand that quite clearly they were very delighted with the way this worked out, and as they should be, because if you look at the assassination of Trotsky, the motivation for it is to get rid of Stalin's chief political and ideological rival within Russia. And what it does is gets rid of Stalin's chief ideological rival in Russia. It does exactly what it's supposed to do and leaves him unchallenged until his death. I think that, it's you could argue even more successful, although quite interestingly, I'm just looking at them here, what do those two both have in common? Russia. So the trick seems to be that if you want a successful assassination, Russia.
Russian.
Although some of the more recent attempts at that kind of don't necessarily suggest that. Although, again, I don't believe the Russian government was involved. Please, Vladimir Putin, don't kill me.
MH17 crashed on its own.
It all crashed on its own, and Viktor Yushchenko in the Ukraine just ate some bad chicken. He wasn't poisoned by your
Nuclear radiation
operatives at all. No, that didn't happen. We may find ourselves rounded up and shot very shortly, guys.
It's maybe a very short series of podcasts.
So there's maybe a one series of podcasts followed by me talking in a very heavy Russian accent, saying that I am apologise for things sincerely, male teacher. And that will kind of be the end of the podcast, I think, and possibly the end of my life too.
I think you've guaranteed yourself a untimely end with that accent.
As long as it's successful, because what we're talking about is...
Was it a successful accent?
Exactly.
Would a person who had no idea what we were talking about understand that to be a Russian accent?
Only
a successful accent.
Only someone who's played Tetris, and that's their whole understanding of Russian accents.
I think just to quickly make a note on Trotsky, the thing that complicates Trotsky's assassination for me is that he was largely a non-entity in Russia by this time. He had largely been erased from the record books. There's a great series of photos off the Russian Revolution in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, where Lenin is giving a fiery speech from a stand that's been erected. Standing to his left is Trotsky. Stalin is nowhere to be seen in the photo. And yet, this photo re-emerges some 10 years later, and Trotsky has been photoshopped out for all intents and purposes. A wooden board has been replaced, or has replaced him in this photograph, and this is the beginning of the purging of the Trotskyists in Russia. And by the time of his assassination, it seems to be more of like a grudge or like a family feud, not the poor game show on TV, but a genuine hatred for Trotsky, not for as political motivation, but just for personal. And when you understand the history of Stalin, you realise that this is a man who would kill for a whim because he wanted to.
It's like the equivalent of you've just beaten somebody at a game of Monopoly. So you've played Monopoly. You've played the game hard. Both sides have played the game quite hard.
Could shake hands.
You've ended up victorious, and then what you do is you actually pull their real wallet out of their pocket and start taking money from that because they still owe you for the hotel they landed on Mayfair. And what you've just done there is you're just rubbing it in now, and you're taking it beyond the purposes of what you want. And yeah, look, I agree with you on that front. Is that Trotsky was mostly a sort of sidelined figure within Russia itself, except in the mind of Joseph Stalin.
That would be a correct point.
And this is kind of another theme of history which we're going to sort of examine in coming podcasts, is that if something is big in the mind of a leader in particular, then it's not dead, no matter how pointless it is. I look at something like Stalingrad in World War II. And Stalingrad of some importance in terms of as a city, but nothing major compared to Moscow, which is the capital. But for Hitler in World War II, it had Stalin's name on it. And you wanted to capture it
Leningrad
because...
as well.
Yeah, exactly. You wanted to capture the names of these people to send a message.
Well, same with capturing where the armistice was signed in the train carriage at end of World War One. As soon as the Nazis conquer France, they move immediately to the place where the German defeat was so catalysed in the Treaty of Versailles, in the armistice at least, that Hitler visits it with other prominent Nazis and almost in a sort of like a flippant way says, "Oh, we're back, but we've turned the tables." And it's very similar to an ancient example where...
Oh, he's delving into my world, folks.
Well, I may not get this necessarily right, but when... Is it in World War II when the British general goes back to... No, I'm thinking of something completely different.
This is what happens when he delves into the murky world of ancient.
I admit my faults of with the ancient world because there's no sources and there's no evidence and it's all just narrative and mythology and Zeus did everything. That's ancient history.
Excuse me. Ramesses the Great won the Battle of Kadesh on his own. There was no one else. He had a chariot. He had a bow and arrow. He had a sword. His army ran away. He beat everyone single-handedly, and we know this because he told us he did it.
See, that's all you got. You got these biased, subjective sources.
There is no bias. It actually... Are you questioning Ramesses? Are you questioning Ramesses? He's called the Great, you know.
Well, look, Alexander was the Great, but was he really great?
I think this is the next podcast.
I think the Great... Has anyone ever earned the title the Great?
I think that's actually the next podcast. I think that's probably a good path to lead this one on.
Someone in Year 7 asked that question.
Yep, someone needs to put that up on the Edmodo page for my Year 7, and if they put it up on the Edmodo page, I'll answer it next podcast, I think, because I think that's a really good one to leave it on, because we've talked about Catherine the Great, we've talked about Peter the Great, we've talked about Ramesses the Great. Got any other greats before we walk out of here? Alexander.
Chris and Thomas the Great.
Chris and Thomas the Great, yes indeed.
Great Australian Bite.
The Great Australian Bite.
Great White Shark.
Great Barrier Reef.
Great Barrier Reef.
Has anything really truly ever been great?
The Great Banana.
We're making America great again.
Make America great again. What is that thing you use to turn cheese into smaller pieces of cheese?
A cheese peeler?
I think it might be a grate.
And on that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls and children of all ages, I think we need to bring this podcast to a shuddering halt, which I think is what just happened with that horrendous pun.
That really grates me.
So, it's getting worse, ladies and gentlemen. You're lucky. When I turn this off, I've still got him sitting to my left. So
what a great outcome this podcast has turned into.
I need to end this before he kills me. So with that in mind, but will it be successful? That's the other important point to note. If he manages to kill me, will it be successful?
What is success?
Exactly. So thanks for coming on, Thomas. It's been an experience.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. All right, and everybody, I look forward to catching you with the next podcast. Feel free to keep those questions coming in. Thank you.